Before I start, I want to warn you in a way. I had an illness in December that was like a flu, and when I recovered, I couldn't speak normally. I still can't. I slur the occasional syllable. So I will try to speak clearly, and we'll have to see how this goes. I apologize in advance. Victorian intellectuals had their religious faith undermined by the higher criticism. I mention Victorian intellectuals not because I'm thinking of the 19th century. They're just the leading edge of what will follow. The intellectual who lost his or her faith in the Victorian age is the average educated person of the 20th century. And since we're now in the 21st century, the 20th century has played itself out entirely. We could see how things have gone. We know there has been a decline in Christianity. I won't bother to document what is well known, just a couple of signs. Church attendance declines in Canada. This shows the decline since 1946. But a better graph, one covering the entire period from the start of the last century onward, would be similar. This very rough graph shows church attendance in Britain between 1851, when the census was begun, and 1981. But it is objected that in this period, Christian influence cannot be traced by observing church behavior, quoting someone. One must rather examine, he says, the religious allegiance of the people. If the issue is who calls themselves a Christian, in Britain, according to the census of 2021, for the first time it is less than half the population of England and Wales. It certainly means something if people do not identify as Christian. But what then of those who do? One writer notes that in a poll that disclosed that over 80% of Americans identify themselves as Christians, only 48% could name the Gospels. It is strangely difficult to find a numeric way to mark what has happened in this period. In any case, there are a lot of factors involved in this, and the only one that I propose to discuss now is higher criticism, which is to say, the new methods of historical analysis that were brought together on the New Testament in the 19th century, which, says one historian, has undermined faith. This seems to be not often discussed. For instance, the so-called father of modern unbelief is not even in the index in all of Justo Gonzalez's and David Bentley Hart's histories of Christianity and the Oxford Illustrated History of Christianity, nor does the issue show up in other accounts, like Tom Holland's Dominion, which is a more thesis-oriented history of Christianity. Holland's point being that while the world may have become less Christian, it has become less Christian in a Christian direction. Gonzalez does, though, have a brief section on this issue, in which he says that the interest in history that characterized the 19th century also left its mark on biblical and theological studies, and, shall we say, Christianity. Well, that is our topic. What was that mark? The question is simply this: how and in what way did historical examination contribute to the dissolving of Christianity, the undermining of faith? Was the undermining, which clearly took place, here Time magazine in 1959 is selling copies by informing its readership of the theology for Protestants, well, less than a decade later, it is asking if God is dead. And things are no better. Some 40 years later, when Newsweek announces the decline and fall of Christian America, the last holdout in the West, was this undermining influenced by the oppositional terms that people were offered? By being told, in effect, your choice is between the traditional Christian view or godlessness. Did insistence upon one way of reading the New Testament scriptures generate rejection by those who cannot accept the texts as having that meaning. My hypothesis, it can hardly be more than that, is this. The effects of historical study of the oldest New Testament texts, which study shows to be copies of missing originals, led to certain conclusions reached about the Bible. We'll look at some of these in a moment. And these were positive contributions to our understanding, but they were not treated as such. And had they not been violently condemned, as they were, they would have had the effect of transforming people's understanding of Christianity, not undermining it. Now, a hypothesis about what would have happened if does not count for anything as history, but it does count for something as a thing to think about. The question is really, what is Christianity? Is it really what has been believed everywhere, always, and by all? What is this question of history? It might be said that it came to be thought that people, Christians included, are historical, which is to say that their views about things change with time. They're not unchanging. Compare this with what we have just seen, and on the face of it, what we have here denies this. Christian beliefs have not changed. Christians, through time, have believed what has been believed everywhere, always, and by all. But there's another way of reading these very same words, which is that by this new way of seeing, the thing that was believed everywhere, always, lies in what the scriptures mean. Some Christians believe they mean that Christ walked on the water, literally, but others, Christians in modern age, do not. And by their way of seeing, this is not a scandalous rejection of Christianity, but a modern continuation of Christianity. It continues Christianity for the reason that what the later Christians believed the texts say is something that all of these people accept and have long accepted. To be more precise, in our age, people came to think that the texts give us the way in which ancient people conveyed what is true. In order to talk about a worldly way of living and an unworldly way of living in the same world, saying things as Peter does at one moment, and seeing them as he does at another, when he too walks on the water, the people who wrote the Gospels told these stories, which are parables, not simple reported accounts. By this way of seeing, the Gospels are not simply history, and they are not simply stories either. They express a mystery. They're talking about an outlook that when you use the material of the world, like storms at sea, to convey it, which you must do because it is this world that everyone knows, results in events that look like miracles. That puts it rather abstractly. Let's look at this more concretely. For instance, Albert Schweitzer, born in 1875, was a man of modern times, a musician, a scholar with a PhD in theology, a Lutheran minister, and a doctor. Take these words from the end of his book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, which came out in 1906. Regarding the names which were given to Jesus as a result of the late Jewish circumstances in which he lived, such as Messiah, Son of Man, and Son of God. Regarding Jesus, we in our day are more historically conscious. And think why that is. We live with books, for instance, as people of the early church did not. We have historians. We know that the present is radically unlike the past, while past people could not guess that that would be so. We are more historically conscious in that we have a very different awareness of the difference between late Jewish circumstances and our own. The names then that were given to Jesus as a result of these circumstances have become historical parables for us. By adopting these titles for himself, Jesus was expressing in the language of his own time his idea of himself as an authoritative ruler. We have no terms today which can express what he means for us. That is, as Schweitzer sees it, the words Son of God means something to a Jew of Jesus' time, but this expresses what he means for them. He is the Son of God, the Messiah, for them, but not for us. Now, this appears to suggest some sort of relativization. The question is, we say, well, what is he through all of time? It should not change. What he was for them, he is for us too. But this is precisely Schweitzer's point. There is still a difference, Schweitzer says, because of history. For the Jews who followed him, he was the Son of God, etc. I'm not going to say what this means. Schweitzer's point is that it has meaning for them in terms of their own traditions. For people in Jesus' time, and when the Gospels were written, because of who he is to them, they listen to him and become his followers because of this. But for us, it is different. The terms by which Jesus was understood then are not ours. Their traditions are not ours. We in our culture are not waiting for a Messiah, for example. We have no terms today which can express what he means for us. We are not called by who he is. The situation is really not one in which we say to him, but first show us who you are. And then he gives us good credentials as a person of authority, as the Son of God. And then we believe. We're called not by who he is, but by the substance of his call. That we follow him is what is the same for his early followers and for us. He says the same words, follow me, and sets us to those tasks which he must fulfill in our time. What has been believed everywhere, always, and by all is that he's telling the truth, calling us to what counts. He commands, and to those who hearken to him, he will reveal himself. Then, in the peace, the labors, the conflicts, and the suffering that they may experience in his fellowship, and as an ineffable mystery, they will learn who he is. What he is, however, differs for them and for us. So, says Schweitzer, he's not the Messiah or Son of God in some kind of factual way indicated in the material world by events like walking on water or by leaving the tomb and returning to life. He's the Son of God not first, and then we believe. He is the Son of God, or God and man, when we enter into the mystery that the Gospels give us an entry to. Regarding historical events, we will say that if something did not happen in history, then it did not happen at all. That is what it means to happen. If it did not occur in time and space where people lived, then it did not happen at all. That is the conception, quite a natural one, of what happening is. Add to this the view that Christianity's key truth claims are about historical events. What constitutes an event? There are, of course, observable historical events, battles, for example, but how much of what history reports is such an event? Is it true that only what is visible is an event? For the events that occurred in history, are we looking for observable things only? If there are some things in history that are observable, the execution of people is observable, and other things that are not observable, things that are larger events, say, to count the resurrection, for example, as the latter, is not to deny it. To count the resurrection as an event that is not observable is not to deny it. But in the simpler framework according to which a thing that happens is observable, to do that is to say that it did not happen. Also, within science, there is an emphasis upon the observable, the empirical. And in this era, the historian is considered a follower of the scientist. Though the data are limited remains, in writing history, you must have concrete things to study. When we are concerned to establish what actually happened in history, you pay them careful attention. But when your concern is texts, does the empirical element extend to the things stated in the text? That is the data what the text reports? Are the things recorded in the text to function as the empirical data, or is the empirical element the manuscript itself, presenting you with a text whose genre is to be determined, whose language is to be understood? Sometimes in ancient texts in which something is stated as happening, something else is being said. There is the question, should we believe the account? But even before that is the question, what first does this account say? So when historiography meets Christianity, what results? You get the critical investigation of the life of Jesus, to quote Schweitzer. This is a big subject, and of course I'm not going to try to encapsulate it, but it is an important enough feature of history, which we are looking at in this whole series of lectures, that we should consider it. Anyone who wants a bigger picture could go here to what has been called the greatest 20th century book on Jesus, but you be the judge. Here Schweitzer says that the story falls into two periods, that before Strauss and that after Strauss. Schweitzer looks at both, but we're going to look at Strauss, at the pivot, at the cause of this disruption. The church had had a perfectly clear picture of Jesus for centuries before the time at which Schweitzer takes up his story in the Enlightenment, when that clear picture was countered by the Enlightenment. The pivot at Strauss, however, opposes both positions. It counters both the original clarity of the past and the Enlightenment alternative. Go back a little earlier, it had been noted in the 18th century that in the New Testament narratives, there are supernatural elements alongside the historical elements of the life of Jesus. On these, in the Enlightenment era, there were two camps. On the one side were the naturalists. These Enlightenment people stated that the gospel stories of the miraculous and the supernatural were impossible. All the things reported, they said, really had natural causes, absolutely natural, scientifically intelligible, that is. Explanations must be sought for all these events. For instance, when Jesus is said to have brought the dead back, the people he revived were naturally not really dead. They were comatose. Strauss, whom we will look at soon, viciously attacked such explanations. The naturalists were opposed to the supernaturalists, which had preceded them. Supernaturalists said that these events were in no way inexplicable. If we simply allow that, God can intervene to cause them. God made the world. He can certainly intervene in it. And so, by Strauss's time, born in 1808, there is an opposition between this group and the naturalists and the deists and rationalists, all the same in this respect. who believes that these events can be naturally explained, rationally explained by nature, leaving God out entirely, except as creator of nature. And if we leap ahead via Khartoum to what resulted from Strauss's attention to this conflict, we'll look at the substance in a minute. Schweitzer has 3 chapters on Strauss. You see here a Swiss editorial cartoon. The word Strauss in German means ostrich. Here we see the devil taking the ostrich to hell. Note the horses, which are supernatural and run into the road. On the right is a blazing pile of books, with a book by Strauss on the top. Behind you see the conservatives. There are now conservatives who wish to conserve the traditional outlook against people like Strauss, people who are thought of as modernists, because the historical critical examination of the life of Jesus is a modern event. You see that the flag of the traditionalists says, "Religion of our fathers." This maintenance of the tradition is the justification for the war, which the conservatives believe was started by the historians. And they are led by the goddess of victory. The goddess of victory is always shown on the side of the ones meant to win. The flag of the opposition, and notice that we do have an opposition here, these are not 2 uncontentious groups. The flag of the opposition is adorned with a golden ostrich and bears a pair of scissors. The German word for scissors is Schere, alluding to another author. Schere is the name of the other named book tossed in the fire, among other unnamed books. He was a reform-minded theologian elected to Zurich's Education Council. Some common folk carrying farm implements as weapons seem to have joined to help the government in the blue uniforms. Are these simple country people? The event that caused the uproar that prompted this cartoon was naming the members of the school board. Some people, quote, wanted to appoint David Friedrich Strauss in the hope that 300 years after the Reformation, the church would modernize. For the conservatives, the 31-year-old German was out of the question, end quote. That is, historical scholarship had created a form of Christianity that relinquished certain Christian truth claims regarding history. We'll see what. And these new thinkers and their followers view this as a proper modernization. And in response to them, we have, maybe, a new breed of person. Christian apologists who stand up against these modernists, though the modernists were critics of the Enlightenment, having said that what the Enlightenment naturalists were doing was misreading the Gospels, the modernists were just as bad because they say this about the supernaturalists too. Both were misreading. It was Schweitzer's later view that this historic criticism has no theological significance. So we see here that it splits a Swiss counter. Schweitzer's claim that historical Jesus scholarship has no theological significance has been very influential, contributing to a relative lack of scholarly interest in the historical Jesus for a major portion of this 20th century. His work brought the quest for the historical Jesus to a temporary close. Only in the past few decades, with the new quest of the 1950s and the 60s and the third quest of the 1980s, has substantial interest in the historical Jesus revived. This book fills that in. But back to the issue. Why was Strauss's work burned? At least in the cartoon. He did not say that it was impossible for God to intervene in his own world. The Enlightenment, the deists, had said that. Strauss said that the texts that reported things like Jesus walked on the water meant something by it that was not literal. Such language was used because we need some way to talk about what the Gospels mean to address. Let's look at this.